Our next speaker is Mr. John Hofmeister. Upon retirement as the president of Shell Oil Company in 2008, Mr. Hofmeister founded he founded and heads the not-for-profit membership organization Citizens for Affordable Energy. This public policy firm promotes sound U.S. energy security solutions for the nation, including a range of affordable energy supplies, efficiency improvements, essential infrastructure, sustainable environmental policies, and public education. He's a business leader who has partnered in the inner workings of multiple industries over 35 years. Hofmeister has also held executive leadership positions in General Electric, Nortel, and Allied Signal. Hofmeister served as the chairman of the National Urban League and chairman of the U.S. Department of Energy's Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technical Advisory Committee, and he serves as a non-executive director of Hunting PLC in London, A+ in Barcelona, and chairs Aran Energy Corporation in Houston. He serves on the National Petroleum Council and many other such organizations. He served as a Wrigley Scholar, executive in residence, the Global Institute for Sustainability at Arizona State. He's also a lecturer at the University of Houston and Kansas State. And this is what I find very interesting as an ex-president of Shell. He earned a bachelor's and master's degree in political science from Kansas State University, and in May 2010 was awarded an honorable doctorate in letters from the University of Houston and from Kansas State. And Mr. Hofmeister told me he was on Bloomberg this morning talking about Rex Tillerson. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Hofmeister, Dr. Hofmeister.
Thank you, Steve. Well, thank you, Steve, and good morning, everyone. Marcia, I think the key words for today may well turn out to be critical thinking. And I'm so happy that you brought it out in the very beginning. Because, ladies and gentlemen, that's what I would like to do in the next few minutes, is to bring some critical thinking to the energy future. Unfortunately, I will not end this talk on a positive note, because my suspicions are critical thinking in the energy space is still some distance from where we are as a society, and in particular where we are in terms of our political leadership. But we'll come on to that. I'd like to start by addressing the most recent chaotic, unsettling, depressing period, particularly in the oil and gas sector, but I could extend that to any part of the energy sector, from renewables to nuclear, power generation as well as transportation, and to those who are committed to startups and trying to get through the valley of death that startups typically experience in today's energy world. Here's my premise. We are today energy adequate despite ourselves, but we are not energy secure without some fundamental change in how we approach energy. I'll cover a few things such as the Bush-Obama effects on energy, the recent man-made geopolitical pricing debacle that the oil and gas industry has been through, the future of recovery, and what's next beyond that, and frankly, what does it all mean for energy prices as we go forward. But just so we're all on the same baseline to start with, let's remind ourselves what energy is all about. Energy is all about molecules, and energy is all about electrons. An amazing thing about electrons, an amazing thing about molecules, they don't register Republican or Democratic. They just are. And they just come through our light bulbs, our motors, or they come through our ignition systems, through our internal combustion engines, or through our electric battery vehicles, without any knowledge as to what was their origin. We have 10 sources of energy 5 traditional, 5 alternative. Traditional, oil, gas, coal, hydropower, nuclear in our system. Alternatives, wind, solar, biomass, geothermal, and hydrogen as an energy carrier. That's it. Those are the only places we're going to find energy with what we know now. But what we don't often think about when we think about the energy system, without infrastructure, you don't have energy. Whether that's the hard infrastructure of pipelines, transmission lines, power plants, shipping terminals, logistics centers, refineries, or the soft infrastructure of regulations, laws, permitting, application processes, and so on. We also need to think simultaneously about technology that drives efficiency. It's absolutely foolish to waste energy because a molecule not used today is available for tomorrow. Same with an electron. So why wouldn't we naturally use whatever technology we can to be efficient? In addition, to think of energy without thinking of environmental protection is to only think about half the equation, which doesn't compute in the end. If you don't protect the environment, then you're going to lose the right or the license to operate an energy company. And of course, the 2 main types of use of energy are power generation and what we use electricity for, and transportation, how we go from point A to point B, depending upon the medium we choose. Now, a lot of people like to talk about American exceptionalism. Well, when it comes to energy, we do have some exceptional characteristics that are worth reminding ourselves of. 1, we have the largest energy system in the world. 2, we have the oldest energy system in the world. And there are implications of both. We have the most fragmented energy system in the world. Our federal system of government ensures that the fragmentation will continue. We have a reliable energy system. It's ubiquitous. It's one of the least expensive for the consumer. It's one of the most improved environmentally because of technology and conscientiousness with respect to environmental protection. But unfortunately, it's also one of the most ideological energy systems, which is why we distinguish between traditional and alternative. And a lot of political energy gets used up in that ideological description. We are technically advanced. Although we do have the oldest energy system, we have some of the newest and latest and best technologies available. But we also have the most dysfunctional energy system that I can point to anywhere in the world, other than perhaps in some developing countries which barely have a system. It's also the most unplanned system in the world. So this exceptionalism has its pluses, but I would say this exceptionalism also has its negatives. With our federal system, we have the most governed energy system I can imagine. There is not a single electron produced in this country. There is not a single molecule of legal fuel produced in this country that is not governed. Every aspect of producing the electron or the molecule is governed at one level or another, or both, or in triplicate if you count local, state, and federal. And that leads us to the question, with so much government and governance involved, what do you say to the free marketers about the future of energy? So a fundamental question of the future of energy is, to what extent is government going to control or run energy and our energy system future? To what extent is industry and the market going to run our energy system and its future? So just a word about the role of companies, because companies do play an important role. And someone like Rex Tillerson, who I confidently recommended on Bloomberg this morning, because when I was asked, he's from the oil industry, what could he possibly know about diplomacy and government? I said, probably more than the last 4 secretaries of state since James Baker, in all reality, because of the nature of the job. And the fact that an energy company entering Russia, entering Nigeria, or entering Indonesia is not just bringing technical resource to the country to exploit natural resources, they're bringing an entire system of education, of local development, of environmental protection, of education, support to the communities and the populations where they operate, and bringing maturity and rule of law, frankly, to government. Because a company like Exxon or my former company Shell is not going to operate without rule of law. And countries that don't have it had better get it if they're going to have the benefits of working with companies like Exxon. So what companies bring, in addition to technology, science, engineering, your specialties. But they also bring people. They bring commerciality, information, the whole system of compliance, regulation, and law as they enforce it on themselves. They bring logistics. They bring returns on investment. And ultimately, they deliver products, those molecules and those electrons. Without regard to the environment, companies lose the license to operate. What did one well that exploded underwater, under the sea, do to BP? Apart from the nearly $60 billion that one well, Deepwater Horizon, I'm sorry, that was the rig, Macondo was the well, nearly $60 billion in outlays. It took the intervention of the British Prime Minister to the President of the United States to say, don't destroy my country's company, BP. Because there was no doubt in most people's minds who were close to this that the United States government was out to destroy BP as a company, break it up and sell off its parts for violating the sacred trust of what they did to the environment in the Gulf of Mexico. And there were some in the industry who would have supported that move. Because at the time, and all credit to Bob Dudley for bringing a different mindset and a different culture to BP, but it wasn't just the Deepwater Horizon and the Macondo well, it was a combination of Texas City and criminal violations in Alaska that added up to damage to the entire industry. Because if you don't protect the environment, you lose the license to operate, as you should. And so companies bring an environmental conscientiousness. In fact, I've been booed for saying the following, so I'll get ready. The best and brightest environmental talent that I have ever met work for natural resource companies, because they do the actual work. They don't sit in an NGO, and I respect many NGOs for their guardianship, but they don't sit in NGOs and determine all kinds of mischievous ways to stop companies from doing what society expects them to do in terms of producing those molecules and electrons. And then companies also learn how to deal with the misfits of society as we see them, the ideologues, the radicals, the naysayers, the disinvestment crowd, who don't understand or refuse to comprehend or close their minds and their attitudes to the thought that traditional energy will be with us till all of us are in our graves. There's just no other way around it. I say all of us in this room. Not for all of time, but for the next 50 to 100 years. We can't see an alternative to other than continuing to make use of traditional fuels in ever cleaner ways. But let's come back to the governance versus the market question. And let's think about how we divide up discussion of that question of governance versus the market. Let's think about how we organize society. We have autocratic societies. Well, they've pretty well determined government's in charge in the autocratic societies. We have the idealistic societies. They tend to also view government as the source of the idealism. Examples of autocratic societies: China, Russia, OPEC countries. Examples of idealistic countries: the Scandinavian countries, Germany, another example. Then we have the pragmatic countries. The pragmatic countries are a well-reasoned and practical balance, such as Canada, Australia, United Kingdom, most of Europe, in fact, are pragmatic about the future of energy. You don't see the adversarialism. You don't see the dramatic advocacy, one side or the other. As someone asked in one of their questions, we seem to be so severely divided. And the fourth category are the schizophrenic, which includes the United States and includes some of the developing countries around the world who really aren't sure what to do, but they know they need energy, and so they'll take whatever they can get and go off and do whatever they can do. And it's the schizophrenic that I worry about the most, perhaps because I'm an American. And what I see and what I experience and what I have experienced in my active career is pure schizophrenia. Let's compare the example of the Bush era and the Obama era. I would facetiously, tongue-in-cheek, describe the Bush era of energy management as the executive branch of the federal government as wink and nod. How do I get to wink and nod? Well, it's the old expression of don't publish what you can just write down. Don't write down what you can say. Don't say what you can nod or wink, and don't wink what you can nod. In other words, keep it to yourself. Don't be too transparent. I was often asked to testify when I was president of Shell Oil, and one of the questions that inevitably came up at every hearing: were you a part of Dick Cheney's secret council on energy in the early days of the Bush administration? The fact that I was living in The Hague and I was working on a global position didn't seem relevant to the senators or the congressmen who asked me that question, so the answer was simple. No, I was not a member of that so-called secret council of energy leaders. But then we had the Obama era, which is just coming to an end. And facetiously, tongue-in-cheek, I would describe the Obama era as, let's pretend. Let's pretend we know what we're doing. Let's pretend we have an all-in, all-the-above energy strategy. Let's pretend we're actually doing something. Let's pretend, and I say this with some anger in my voice, let's pretend we really care about the environment and climate change. Let's pretend the Paris Accords actually mean something. And when you consider the human effort that went into writing the 199 pages of the Paris Accord, and I've read every word of them, you know, there's not one sentence, there's not one paragraph, there's not one section in the Paris Accords, COP21, December 2015, that says anything about compliance or enforcement. In fact, there was a crisis at the last minute in the negotiations, which is little published and much discussed, certainly not in the White House, where the French translation to English of the Paris Accord included the word, the parties shall do the following. The Americans couldn't have that. The word shall is a meaningful word legally in a country of laws. And shall meant the accord had to be treated as a treaty. And an international treaty in this country has to have what? Senate approval. And so where did the U.S. delegation go for help at the 11th hour of the Paris Accords? To the Chinese, who had the equal resolve that this would be a non-binding agreement. And the compromise reached between the Americans and the Chinese the night before the signing of the accord was to replace every shall with should, because legally it presents a very different picture. Let's pretend climate change matters. I'm very angry about that because it has set in motion a false pretense that leaves future administrations the freedom to do whatever they choose, when in fact we have a global issue that must be addressed. And if we don't have credible government leadership through such a process, through such a period of time, where will we end up? At any rate, market versus government, we'll come back to that. But let's dig a little deeper into what I mentioned as the geopolitical man-made dilemma of the recent period, 14, 15, and 16 in this century. 4 global players. Deputy Crown Prince bin Salman from Saudi Arabia, Vladimir Putin, whose name features largely today, Supreme Leader Khatami, and missing in action, President Obama. From 1940s and Franklin Roosevelt, who on a U.S. ship in the Arabian Gulf said to King Saud to his face, "Your Excellency, you produce the oil, we'll have your back," or words to that effect. And from Franklin Roosevelt until George W. Bush, the official public foreign policy of the United States of America was to defend the Saudi Arabian potential of producing oil for the world, including the United States, who depend on imports every day of the week. Every day of the week, today. 7 million barrels a day, or we don't have enough oil to do what we do, to fly our planes, to drive our cars. Well, that suddenly changed when the U.S. went missing in action. And so Saudi Arabia, for the first time in 70 years, is exposed. Exposed to a hegemonic relationship between Iran and Russia, between Sunni and Shia, to redefine life in the Middle East, political life in the Middle East. And to the Saudis, it was a mortal threat. So facing a mortal threat, and you're Saudi Arabia, what are the tools in your arsenal to defend yourself and to maintain your life and well-being? One major tool, oil price. So by overproducing oil, arguing market share, but meaningfully and seriously endeavoring to weaken the economies of Iran and Russia to send a message, back off, back off. Russia and Iran responded by also overproducing. They could conveniently blame American shale because America is silent in this whole debate. And America is not stepping up to say to Russia or to Iran, back off in Saudi Arabia, back off in the Middle East. So the Saudis were exposed. And the consequence of the overproduction, which I lay at the feet of the passing administration, nearly 500,000 jobs lost in this country, without a word of remorse. Not a word of remorse to those 500,000 people who've lost their jobs. And what would be the consequence if 500,000 auto workers lost their jobs in this country? What would be the consequence if 500,000 postal workers lost their job in this country? Aerospace workers? But 500,000 oil and gas workers? Doesn't move the dot. There's a certain bitterness you can probably detect, but heartfelt. Because a let's pretend energy policy doesn't work. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, the Saudis have had enough of impoverishing themselves, and they're going to restrain production. because two fundamental questions that exist in energy space, broadly speaking, regardless of how we resolve the market versus government balance, two fundamental questions exist, and we have struggled to answer them. One question is, what do we have to do to achieve an equilibrium between demand and supply? It's the equilibrium that the industry seeks. It's the equilibrium that determines the affordability of the world's use of energy. And the second question is, how do we achieve sustainability over time? We have neither answers, no answers to either question at the present time, because the Paris Accord won't do it. The Clean Power Plan may as well have not been passed, or decided, I should say, by the EPA. It wasn't passed by anyone. It was only approved by the EPA, which is why it will fail, because it doesn't have the legal standing. And when 26 states sue the federal government for overreach, that's a pretty serious threat to the regulatory process that the EPA put the Clean Power Plan through. And if you're not familiar with that Clean Power Plan, it is an effort to revamp the traditional power generation industry that we've known in this country, which frankly I support in purpose, but not process. Because if the process is not bipartisan, if the process is not legislative rather than regulatory, the process is a failure. And we once again have pretended to do something when we actually did not. So sustainability is at risk, and equilibrium are at risk. So what are we going to do? And this is the punchline of what I have to say. And you may say, why did we ever bring a political scientist to say this? We have to come to grips, ladies and gentlemen, in my view, with a Hegelian dialectic. If you're not familiar with Hegelian dialectics, it's the old notion of you have a thesis, and I'm sure you in your studies have come across this forever. You have a thesis, and there is inevitably an antithesis. So between the thesis and the antithesis. So what I'm suggesting is government and industry, thesis, antithesis, or government, free market, thesis, antithesis. What do we do in our schizophrenic approach to energy? It's either good energy or bad energy, traditional energy or alternative energy, sustainability switch on, sustainability switch off. What do we do in this divided democracy to create the synthesis? Because the synthesis is the ultimate resolution of the division of government and industry, to find a combination of government and industry, because we need both, to resolve the dilemma of equilibrium and the dilemma of sustainability. What do I mean by this? Well, this is not that foreign a concept. It may be to energy people. It may be to the political groups that oversee energy, ranging from the federal to the state to the local governments, because they only know what they know based upon existing laws and regulations, based upon existing practices, and whether they're an energy have state or an energy have not state, they have different opinions on it as political leadership. But the answer is not that difficult if you apply the principles of finding the synthesis. Just move parallel, move to the right or to the left, whichever way you're more comfortable, and recognize this nation today would not be what it is today as the world's largest economy, the world's only safe currency, the world's only country that can see its way clear, having depoliticized to a very, very large extent money. We learned the lesson, didn't we? We learned the lesson in the late 19th and early 20th century history of America, when we realized full well, because of multiple crises with the money supply and with the management of money, that we didn't have an authority to determine the future of money in this country. And thanks to the careful thinking of Theodore Roosevelt, but the even more careful thinking of William Taft, and the willingness of William Taft to dig deeply into this issue, we were able temporarily to recover from the 1907 currency debacle of the times, when J.P. Morgan and his friends bailed out the monetary system through loans to the U.S. Treasury with a promise that the problem would be fixed, except it wasn't. And in 1912, we had a repeat of 1907. And in 1913, thanks to the wisdom and perseverance of Woodrow Wilson, so now we have 2 Republicans plus a Democrat, we got the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 stands the test of time from then till now of having resolved the equilibrium of demand-supply of money, doesn't it? And who did we go to rescue us in 2008 and 9? We didn't go to the U.S. Congress. We didn't go to the White House. We went to the Federal Reserve. And good fortune and fate had Ben Bernanke in the chair, who was a student of the Depression, whose PhD concentrated on the Depression so he could maturely reflect on, with wisdom of forethought, the consequences of what we were facing in terms of the meltdown of the financial system of the country and the growing disequilibrium, I should say, of the money supply. And steps were taken, and we pulled back from what could have been a truly awful financial debacle. Despite that, it was very painful. Despite that, millions of people lost their homes, millions of people lost their jobs, but it could have been so much worse. So if we have a monetary system where we have once and for all created the system, the laws, the infrastructure, and the capability to manage something as complex but as important as the monetary system of this country, what would be so difficult to bring parallel thinking to the energy system of this country? Parallel thinking to creating an independent regulatory authority that sets the big rules, the way the Federal Reserve sets the big rules for the monetary system. How about an independent regulatory authority to set the big rules for the energy system, which includes the environmental system? How difficult is that? Well, actually, not very, except it challenges every entrenched interest that exists. On K Street, they call me dead on arrival Hofmeister, because K Street would be smaller if the regulatory agency for energy was created similar to the Federal Reserve, because guess what? You cannot legally lobby the Federal Reserve. Interesting fact of life, the monetary system is not lobbied. What would the energy system look like if it was not lobbied? Maybe we could move away from dysfunction towards function. Wouldn't that be amazing? If the President of the United States thinks he is in charge of the energy system, guess what? No, he's not. He can pretend to be. That's the best anyone could do. And whether it's Bush or whether it's Obama or whether it's Clinton or whether it's Bush 1, they can only pretend because they don't write the laws. They can only regulate based upon the laws. And overreach is generally is adjudicated. And if we don't fix this, ladies and gentlemen, we now have a new president. We may see a relaxation of some of the regulations that were put in place over the last 8 years. We may see a reversal in philosophy towards, or attitude towards, traditional energy and its role in the future versus alternative energy. We may see exceptions taken to various and sundry environmental protection rules and regulations, perhaps to the disadvantage of society, but to the advantage of industry, in terms of enabling practices or enabling new ways of doing things. But that doesn't fix the underlying problem. That doesn't address the fundamental issue of equilibrium of supply and demand and the unending issue of what we do about the future of sustainability. So, as an industry person, I look forward to the future, always do, because here's the opportunity. There is no reason, no right, rational, logical reason, instead of being energy adequate, that we couldn't be energy secure, except our own inability to get there. We have more potential supply of energy, not only for the United States, but for the world, than we could ever use. And it's not going away. When you take all 10 sources, including hydrogen as an energy carrier, and you look at the evolution and the development of technology to support all 10 sources, you can clean up the dirty. I promised Ed Markey once, he's now senator from Massachusetts, he was congressman from Boston area. I promised him, you give me 30 years, I'll give you emission-free refineries. I checked that out with our chief scientists within Shell. We could modify the processes over time to produce oil products, petrochemicals, with zero emissions from the ground base of the refinery system itself. But it would take time and money. And without government subsidy, it would take 30 years. Ed Markey said, John, we don't have the time. This was during the discussions on cap and trade in 2007 and 8. And I said to Ed, if we don't get a cap and trade bill or some price on carbon bill now, it's going to be 30 years till you can try to do it again. So pick your 30-year period. We can go for emission-free and actually have something at the end of 30 years, condition being all companies become emission-free in the space, not just one. Or we can sit back and do nothing, except argue over whether we should or shouldn't price carbon. Well, we know where that ended up. We have no bill, no law, and a simply utter divide across the nation with no prospects for a price on carbon. So I end on that pessimistic note. We can fix all this and look forward to a better day, to look forward to energy nirvana, energy security globally, and the 2 billion people without energy can see their energy coming. Or we can continue to do what we do. We can continue to be held hostage by autocrats in our democracy, because we will not take the steps to be energy independent by ourselves, because to do so would mean a serious change in our dependence on oil to shift towards a dependence on natural gas, which remains a fossil fuel, which is anathema to the environmental community who want all fossil fuels to go away. So we will not find resolution, leaving it to the democratic processes, and that to me is deeply concerning. If we were willing to provide experts the regulatory authority in an independent manner on our monetary system, and this is my final question, why can't we find that capacity for our energy system, which is every bit as vital to our society and to our future as our monetary system? Thanks for listening. We have time for a question? Sure. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Just to one-up you for a second on your pessimism. Many people believe, and your example of the monetary system, I think, demonstrates that until we have a crisis, very little changes in a democratic society. And one can name, multiple sectors in which one can find this to be true. Interestingly, what you said at the end, which is, I think, the messaging to the American people, which is, we have plenty of energy. In fact, America is becoming increasingly energy independent. How does one kind of understand or perhaps create the crisis that will necessitate legislation?
I think that the Middle East will probably be the answer to the question. In my view, and I'm not the world's authority, but I have an opinion, in my opinion, the degradation of the Middle East will get worse and worse and worse. And ultimately, the oil card will be played. And when the oil card is played, and our vulnerability as a nation is 7 million barrels a day, and we're back to the gas lines of the 1970s and odd even rationing, if we can even get it on those days, the crisis will be fresh upon us. And we will realize that 50 some odd years later, we never addressed Richard Nixon's call for energy independence, which he made in 1973. So I think that's the most likely scenario. I think we are struggling with difficulty to electrify the fleet, but electrification obviously is a good alternative. But electrification has its other problems associated, such as range anxiety and a few other problems as to what is the source, for example, of electrons for battery vehicles. How trustworthy is a hydrogen fuel cell system? We don't know. We know the Hindenburg and hydrogen. We don't know the value of the hydrogen refueling system and its potential dangers. What we also don't know is whether our oil industry, and I'm part of that, could rationalize or handle the de-emphasis on oil for the increased emphasis on natural gas as a fuel for vehicles, a liquid fuel for vehicles. So we could use our current internal combustion engines to accept more alcohol fuel made from natural gas rather than oil products. So there are possibilities that we could rationally come to avoid the crisis, but I do agree with you that in the end, absent a crisis, and of course it was the monetary crisis of 1907, 1912, which enabled presidents to do the right thing with respect to the monetary system. I don't hope for a crisis, but I think it would change the system for good. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.